I mean, it's a great story because I think it outlines in practical terms, in many ways, what you're talking about when you're talking about a pedagogy of insurrection. And you talk, you've had a couple of articles about this, and you talk about multicultural education isn't enough,
Mhm.
and you also talk about some of the tensions between sort of liberal individualism and collective action. And I think that, so we'd like to get you to, expand on that a little bit, but this particular example that you're using, um, it seems like a concrete example of the process that you're outlining, but outlining in more theoretical terms.
Yeah, and I think what thinking about, I sort of framed it as pedagogy of insurgency, um, and and for me, it's sort of, again, like I said just a little bit earlier, around where do I sort of stand and go with my version of multicultural education, right? And so there's something much more radical and transformative in, for instance, the growth of this Black Lives Matter at School day and week, and the work that happened in John Muir Elementary, because it's really calling into question, right? There's some forms of multicultural education that are just, a lot of them are merely about access, right? Nothing wrong with a highly capable program. We just need more kids to take the test, right? More kids of color to take the test, right? Or we just need more Black and brown teachers, which I think we do need, but that becomes the end goal. We just need more Black and brown teachers. That's going to fix it. We just need get more kids into college. Whereas this version of multicultural education really becomes about, okay, it's based in community. It's about community transformation and transformation of education, and it's got a much more activist and much more rebellious streak running through it, in a way that would actually turn off the mainstream multiculturalists in most situations, as being too radical or too causing too much trouble. Um, and so I think for me, that's sort of what I'm always trying to push, is that version of multicultural education. But again, like you just said, though, there's this whole thinking around, really it ends up something that's based around collective action, because like that's where we're both stronger and safer, frankly. If we're moving purely individually, and this is just basic activist and organizing 101 in many ways, right? If you're moving purely individually, then you're very easily, either stomped out or neutralized in whatever form, whether it's just having your power taken away from you or whatever. But the collective work that happened for folks at John Muir, like that created a community, it created a safety net for folks, and then it also just enabled us to um, um, just feel more free together, because we're moving together, out into the world and out into the district. And so, yeah, I mean, it, yeah, I don't know. It's difficult for me to put a finger on all that, just because it was that moment was really close to me, and I've tried to make sense of it through the writing, but I haven't always felt most successful about it, in the process.
Um, yeah, sort of imminent to some of the things that you've been saying, around these tensions and these issues. At one point earlier, you mentioned that you see your role as sort of, not moderating your language. You said you're strategic, um, but that you're playing a role of trying to push the conversation and push, a sense of possibility. And one of the questions we wanted to ask you, is, and I think we want to ask you this especially sort of for practitioners and teachers, and how and those who are committed to social justice, but maybe working in contexts where, they're working in more difficult cultural and political contexts where there aren't people who identify with that kind of language or that kind of politics. And is there a sense of ethical responsibility for reaching outside, the circle, and or how can teachers sort of navigate the tensions that they may confront in wanting to do social justice work, but they're confronted with either reactionary politics or liberal indifference? I don't know. Yeah.
I want to be clear. We had plenty of, not just liberal indifference, but passive aggressive resistance from liberals in Seattle, particularly white liberals and from more affluent neighborhoods and communities. who came back at us with all lives matter and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to paint Seattle as some sort of liberal utopia by any means. Yeah, you raise a good question. I mean, part of me, there is an activist sort of organizer response to say that, when we're organizing and we're raising consciousness around stuff, some people think of, I'm not saying you do this, but I think some people think that the goal is to try and sway like the far right, whatever, to your position. When in reality, most of those folks won't be swayed from anything, right? They're not in a space, like even to put it in Vygotskian terms, their ZPD is nowhere near to what we're trying to get to. And I think the more important conversation, the more important audience is really the bulk of people in the middle who kind of are trying to figure out which way they lean, or they have partial knowledge in either direction. And those are the folks that I think are who we're actually trying to move, not the most alienated on the margin sort of conservatives, right? In part because I think that's where it's also just, there's a calculus of energy and where you're going to get sort of the most bang for your buck, if you want to put it that way, speaking in neoliberal terms, I guess. If you want to be the most effective, it's going to be on moving a bunch of the folks in the middle than it is on moving folks on the fringes. So like, I'm less concerned about those folks. Besides, those folks are usually attacking me anyways, the ones way out on the far right. But I've also ceded some of that ground, just to be honest. As soon as I sort of outed myself as a Marxist, although if you read my work, you'd have to be ignorant to not understand that I was a Marxist. Now I've put a thing out there that where people, if they want to discredit me, particularly in a sort of red baiting moment, they would just be able to use that to discredit me with some mainstream circles, right? And so there's a whole sort of conversation around that. But I've never been, shy or quiet about who I am or my politics and what I was doing too, and everything that I did. I just didn't always shout that I was a Marxist, at least until I put out that particular book. But in terms of teachers who are working in more limited spaces, right? It's really difficult, and I want to be clear. So despite my radicalism, I feel very strongly, and this is really the Marxist in me too, is that we are all working within our given context. Like any context is constrained by certain things, and so I think the job of any educator who's trying to do good, work around educational justice, for instance, the first thing I always tell, like right now I teach teachers too. The first thing I tell my future teachers is like, you need to learn your building and your community. You need to understand what the politics are, folks in that community, what the history is, who the students are in front of you, and then also the same issues for that building, right? Where's leadership at? Where do they stand on various issues? Who are your colleagues? Who are your like? Our students who are going to be teachers need to go and study their context just like they would study anything else, because that context is going to potentially set up certain limits to your relationships and politics, and you need to understand that so that you can understand, how far can you push, right? Where is that edge so that you can figure out what a good push is versus the kind of push that'll just immediately get you fired, right? And so I'm always recommending to folks in whatever context, even in liberal Seattle, to figure that out, because in different communities there's different spaces that you just get afforded to work in, and also there's also part of that is also to say look for the opportunities too, right? Just because you might be in a conservative rural area, for instance, doesn't mean you can't teach about this stuff. But you got to be really, really smart about what you do and how you do it, because there's things that folks are experiencing in those rural areas that they'll relate to. If you're going to talk, certainly around class and economic stuff, and the reproductions of inequalities, and this whole idea, this basically meritocracy does not really existing based on life opportunities. Like those are all things you can teach in all kinds of contexts. And then you can use that to start to push the questions potentially in other spaces around maybe race or gender or sexuality, right? And I don't want to be stereotypical either, because a lot of it is even school to school within these contexts. I was just, I had a guest speaker in one of my classes who does a lot of work on transgender students. And the speaker was just talking about a school that was the site of their research where it was really terrible in terms of how the school responded. And there was a vice principal being really abusive to the students and that kind of stuff. But really, the next school over actually had a supportive administration, and things were a lot better for transgender students in that space, right? So, and this was in a conservative rural southern area. And so, I don't want to be stereotypical about that. I just think that our contexts are really specific sometimes. And even if we might have general understandings of maybe the overall shade of politics in a particular area, that there are spaces to move here and there. And so I definitely encourage practitioners to be really strategic about that. And sometimes you just don't know. You can just step on a landmine, you don't know it, and that's it. You're done. You're out of your job, right? That can always happen. And then the other piece, I think, and this is one of the upsides of, for instance, when there is an ethnic studies state standard, for instance, or some other diversity-related standard, to always find make sure you have backing for what you do. There's research evidence to back up this stuff. If you have a state standard that's there, like if you want to put this to work, you're like, look, I'm just doing what the research says is good for the student population, or the state has already endorsed this kind of teaching. I'm just doing state standard, right? Like there's something to be said for having official backing for what you do. And then finally, I'll say, again, it's a context thing. Like, if in whatever context you're in, like getting, you can't get the more radical version of multicultural education, but you can start pushing on the more sort of liberal, maybe global cultural stuff or whatever. Like that's okay if that's what you can get done, and you can start to move the conversation and at least expose your kids to a bigger an understanding of a bigger world. Like if that's the step you can take in that context, then that's the step you take, right? And be okay with that, right? And be prepared for when there's an opening for you to take that next step, because you don't know when our big context is going to change, right? Like I said earlier, we didn't used to be able to talk about white supremacy openly in such a flippant way. Now you can, and so there are spaces where you couldn't teach about white supremacy before, you can teach about it now, right? And so when those openings happen, be there to do that. And then finally, the other thing I'll say, I probably keep saying finally, but I keep remembering things. The other thing I always tell my future teachers and current teachers is find your people, because no matter where you are, you're much stronger with a network, both in terms of your mental health, right? But also your pedagogic and curriculum and teacherly health too. Everywhere there's networks all over the place of progressive teachers, and go find them. Use Rethinking Schools, for instance, as a way to find folks who might be in your area, whatever. Try and find those people, because if you can find your people, even if you're the one teacher at your school, find the other one teacher at the next school over and hang out and vent to each other, and also share curriculum, right? It's critically important for us to be able to attend to that, and if we're going to be successful in this work. So